The word hit Annie Dalton like a slap across the face, sharp and sudden in the dry Texas air. "Worthless," Earl Dalton said again, louder this time, loud enough that the chickens scattered from the porch steps and the neighboring fields seemed to hold their breath. "That is what you are, woman, you and that girl of yours, worthless as drought-cracked earth." Annie did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only encouraged him. She stood in the center of the kitchen, both hands flat on the rough-hewn table, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because he had woken her before dawn and dragged her from her bed by it, and she kept her eyes steady and her jaw locked, and she did not flinch. But her daughter, Lily, was watching from the doorway. That was the part that broke something in Annie Dalton that could not be unbroken. Lily was 9 years old. She had Annie's dark eyes and Earl's unfortunate temper, though Lily's anger was the kind born from witnessing injustice, rather than from the entitled cruelty that ran through her father like a vein of poison ore. Lily stood in the door of that kitchen in her cotton nightgown and her bare feet, and her face was a map of every secret she had been forced to keep, every bruise she had seen bloom on her mother's arms, every night she had pressed her hands over her ears and pretended the sounds from downstairs were just the wind. Annie looked at her daughter's face and made a decision. 3 days later, she had packed everything she could carry into a single canvas bag and borrowed a horse she promised herself she would return, and she and Lily left Caldwell County, Texas, in the blue-gray hour before sunrise. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months, 2 towns, 3 jobs that did not last, 1 robbery at the roadside that took the last of her saved coin, and now she was here in the hardscrabble town of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory in the summer of 1882, standing outside the general store with her daughter's hand in hers and exactly 11 cents in her dress pocket, reading a hand-lettered notice pinned to the post. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Stone Ridge cattle operation. Fair wages. Decent quarters. Applied to Amos Stone at the end of County Road 7. Annie read it twice. Then she looked down at Lily, who had grown too quiet over these 4 months, too watchful, too careful, the way children get when they have learned that the world is a place that can betray you without warning. She read it a 3rd time. Then she pulled the notice off the post, tucked it inside her dress and said, "Come on then." The road to Stone Ridge was 7 miles of pale yellow grass and wide sky, and they walked most of it because the horse Annie had borrowed had gone lame outside of Billings, and she had traded him to a farrier for 2 weeks of meals. Lily did not complain about the walking. She never complained about anything anymore, and Annie thought that was perhaps the saddest thing she had ever seen. The ranch appeared at the end of the road like something from a dream she had not dared to dream in years. It was not grand, not by any stretch, but it was solid. Solid timber fences, solid-looking barn, solid house with a real stone chimney and glass in the windows rather than oilcloth, and a yard that was clean and purposeful. There were cattle in the far fields, a dark sea of them moving slowly against the Montana sky, and there was a man working alone near the fence line, his back to them, his movements methodical and unhurried. He had not heard them come up the road. He was repairing a section of fence, his hands working with a kind of quiet competence that Annie noticed even from a distance, not because she was looking for anything, she told herself firmly, but because she had learned to read men the way a doctor reads symptoms. Fast hands and loud voices meant trouble. Slow hands and silence could go either way. This man was slow-handed and silent, and she filed that away without deciding what it meant. "Hello," she called out, because standing watching a man from behind felt like bad manners and possibly dangerous. He turned. He was perhaps 35, 36, with the kind of face that the territory had carved into sharp relief, strong bones under sun-darkened skin, a jaw that had a week's worth of dark stubble on it, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that Annie had never seen before, the color of sage after rain. He was not a small man, but he was not ostentatiously large either, just broad-shouldered and capable-looking, with worn work gloves and a hat that had seen better decades. He looked at her, he looked at Lily, he looked back at her. "Mrs.," he said. "Dalton," she said. "Annie Dalton, and this is my daughter Lily. I am here about the position." Something moved across his face. Not unwelcome, not calculating, just a brief flicker of assessment that he did not bother to hide or exaggerate. He pulled off one glove, reached into his shirt pocket, and produced a second copy of the same notice she carried. "Cook and housekeeper," he said. "Yes, I am Amos Stone." He paused. "The job includes a room, 2 rooms actually if there is a child." Annie felt Lily's hand tighten around her fingers. "There is a child," Annie said. He nodded once as if that settled something. "Can you cook?" "I can cook better than anyone in this county who has not tried me yet," she said, and was mildly surprised to hear the steadiness in her own voice. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Can you start tomorrow?" She almost said, "I can start right now." Instead she said, "Yes." "Good." He pulled the second glove back on and turned back to the fence. "House is unlocked. Mrs. Pruitt, who had the position before, left it clean. Your rooms are upstairs, 2nd door and 3rd door. Supper is at 6. I eat late because I work late." And that was that. No examination of her references. No lengthy interrogation. No look that wandered where it should not go. He simply turned back to his fence as if the matter were settled, and Annie stood there for a moment with the dry Montana wind moving through her hair, and she could not tell if she trusted that or not. She decided to reserve judgment and find the kitchen first. The kitchen was the best room in the house. Annie established this within 10 minutes of walking through the door. It had a proper cast iron stove, a good-sized table, deep shelves stocked with flour and dried beans and salt pork and preserves, a window over the wash basin that looked out onto the side yard and the mountains beyond, and a hook on the wall where someone had hung a small dried bundle of sage and lavender. That detail, that small domestic gesture of someone who had cared about this room, made something in Annie's chest loosen almost painfully. Lily stood in the center of the kitchen and turned in a slow circle. "It has a real floor," Lily said. "Wood floor." "It does," Annie said. "Our last place had a dirt floor." "This is better," Annie said, and got to work. She had supper ready at 6 o'clock precisely. She had found a good beef stock in the cold cellar, root vegetables, dried herbs, and she had made a proper stew and a pan of cornbread, and she had set the table with 2 places, and then after a moment's thought had set it with 3, because Lily needed to eat at a table like a person and not be shuffled off to eat alone. Amos Stone came in at 2 minutes past 6. He had washed his hands and face at the pump outside, and his wet dark hair was pushed back from his forehead. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. "I usually eat at the counter," he said. "The table is better for meals," Annie said, in a tone that was not quite arguing but was not retreating either. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down at the table. Lily was watching him with the careful, measuring look she had developed over the past 4 months, the look that was constantly scanning for signs of the thing she feared most. Amos Stone looked back at her with what Annie could only describe as respect. Not the patronizing gentleness adults sometimes used with children, not the dismissive inattention that was more common, just a straightforward regard that treated Lily as a person worth acknowledging. "You like beef stew?" he said to Lily. "Yes," Lily said carefully. "Good. Your mother made enough to feed a cattle drive." He picked up his spoon. It was not a joke exactly. It was something quieter than a joke, but Lily almost smiled. It was barely a fraction of a smile, a small rebellion of the muscles at the corner of her mouth, but Annie saw it, and she bent her head over her own bowl so neither of them would see what it did to her. The first week passed in a rhythm that Annie had not known in years. Work, real purposeful work, the kind that produced visible results and filled the hours without the constant undertow of fear. She cooked and cleaned and organized the house with a focused efficiency that was also, she recognized, a way of controlling something when so much had been out of her control for so long. She fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door. She mended a curtain. She reorganized the root cellar in a way that would prevent spoilage, which she mentioned to Amos Stone at supper, and he listened and then said, "Good. Do whatever you think is needed." That sentence, "Do whatever you think is needed," it lodged in her chest like a splinter, but a warm one, like the memory of something good rather than the warning of something sharp. She had not been told that in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone trust her judgment about anything. Lily, meanwhile, began to unfurl by degrees. She had always been a child who loved animals with a ferocity that bordered on the religious, and Stone Ridge was full of animals. The barn cats, 3 of them, adopted her immediately with the sixth sense that cats have about which humans most need them. There was a border collie named Pepper who followed Amos around the fields during the day and transferred his loyalty to Lily in the evenings with casual emotional disloyalty. There was a bay mare in the barn named Tuesday who let Lily brush her mane on the second day, which Lily reported to Annie in a tone of voice she had not used since before everything went wrong, a breathless, wonder-filled voice that reminded Annie of the child Lily had been before she learned to brace herself. Amos Stone, Annie noticed, was not the kind of man who made a production of kindness. He did not perform it. When he let Lily come out to the fields with him on the 3rd morning, he did not announce it as a special treat or make a ceremony of it. He simply said, "You can come along if you want," the same way he would have said it to any competent person whose company he found acceptable. And Lily went, and came back that evening with dusty boots and flushed cheeks, and something healing in her eyes that Annie had been praying for since the night she had decided to run. It was on the 6th evening, after Lily had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, that Annie was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes, and she heard Amos Stone's boots on the floor behind her and then stop. She did not tense. She realized this consciously, that she had not tensed, and it was such a profound absence of something she had lived with for years that it stopped her mid-movement, her hands still in the wash water. "You do not have to do the dishes tonight," he said from behind her. "It is late." "I do not mind," she said. A pause. Then he came to stand beside the basin, not close enough to crowd, and he picked up the drying cloth and began to dry the plates she had washed. She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the window at the dark outside. "You are from Texas," he said. It was not a question. She had a Texas drawl that Montana had not yet softened. "Yes," she said. "Caldwell County," he said, and she looked at him sharply. He met her eyes. "The man who runs the feed operation in town, Hewitt, he said a woman and a girl came through last week asking for work. He said she had a Caldwell County accent and she was running from something." The bottom dropped out of Annie's stomach. "And you still hired me." "I hired you because you can cook and you are clearly capable and your daughter needed somewhere safe," he said. It was completely matter of fact. No judgment in it, no heroics, no implication of any hidden motive or expectation of gratitude. Just facts laid out plain. Annie stared at the dish in her hands. "My husband," she began and stopped. "You do not have to tell me," Amos said. "I want to," she said, and surprised herself because she did. "He is not dead. He is back in Texas. He is the kind of man who mistakes loudness for strength and who found out too late that I was not the kind of woman who would break entirely. I took my daughter and I left. That is the sum of it." Amos dried a cup in silence. Then he said, "Is he the kind of man who follows?" She had been asking herself this question every night since Caldwell. "I do not know," she said honestly. "He has pride, enough pride that losing me would sting him, but he is also the kind of man who hates difficulty above all things, and finding us would be difficult." Amos nodded slowly. "If he comes here," he said, and stopped. "You cannot promise me anything about that," Annie said a little sharply. "You do not know him." "No," he said, "but I know my land, and I know that things that happen on my land are my business." He put down the drying cloth. "Good night, Mrs. Dalton." He left the kitchen, and she stood alone in it with the wash water going cold around her hands, and something shifting in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. The summer deepened. July came in with brutal heat even here in the territory, and the work of the ranch did not pause for weather. Amos had 3 hired hands who came in for the cattle work. two brothers named Cal and Pete Harver, and an older man called Silas who had been on the Stone Ridge operation longer than anyone and who treated Annie's arrival with the cautious approval of a man who had been eating Amos Stone's mediocre cooking for 2 years and was profoundly grateful for the change. Silas was the one who told her the shape of Amos Stone's history, because Silas was the kind of old man who believed that information, shared kindly and without manipulation, was a form of respect. He told her on a morning in mid-July when he came in for the midday meal early and found Annie making bread. "You want to know about him," Silas said, without preamble, sitting down at the kitchen table and folding his weathered hands on top of it. Annie had her back to him and she did not turn around. "I am his hired help," she said. "His personal history is his own." "You want to know," Silas said again, pleasantly. She turned around, folded her arms, and looked at him with an expression that was at least partly a concession. "All right," she said. Silas nodded, as if settling in to tell a proper story. "He came out to the territory from Ohio 11 years ago. He was 24, 25, and he came out with a wife, Helena, beautiful woman, smart woman. She lasted 3 winters." He paused. "Not his fault. Fever took her, second winter. No child survived it either. She was carrying when the fever came." Annie felt the weight of that settle over her. "I am sorry for him," she said quietly. "He does not talk about it," Silas said. "Keeps it the way he keeps most things, inside, compressed like coal under pressure. You would not know it to look at him. He built the operation from nothing after she died, just worked himself into the ground for about 4 years straight, and somewhere along the way he came out the other side. Not healed, not exactly, but steady. You understand the difference." "I understand the difference," Annie said. "He is not a man with a hidden motive," Silas said, looking at her directly. "Whatever you might be used to expecting from men. He is not running a trap. He is just a quiet man who runs his land and keeps his word and does not much know what to do with the fact that he has been alone a long time and it has started to feel wrong." Annie turned back to her bread dough. "You are very forthcoming for a hired hand," she said. "I am old," Silas said cheerfully. "Old men have earned the right to be forthcoming." She thought about what Silas had told her for days afterward. It did not change how she worked or how she spoke to Amos Stone, but it changed the quality of her attention, the way she watched him at the supper table, the way she heard the long silences that were not uncomfortable but were full, the way she cataloged small things. The way he always left her the largest piece of whatever meat was on the table without making a ceremony of it. The way he asked Lily questions about her day with a genuine interest that never flagged. The way he had quietly added a small bookshelf to the girl's room one morning, while Annie was hanging laundry, filled with used books he must have acquired from somewhere, and had said nothing about it to anyone. The way he watched her when he thought she was not watching back. She let herself admit that she was watching him back. The crisis came in the 2nd week of August, and it came fast, the way crises do in the territory, without the decent warning of buildup. Lily had been riding Tuesday in the corral under Amos's instruction, which had become an afternoon ritual that Annie watched from the kitchen window with something that she refused to examine too closely, because it looked remarkably like the early symptoms of hope. On this particular afternoon, Annie was making pie, which was a task she loved for its precision, when she heard Lily's voice rise outside. Not the breathless, happy sound of a girl learning to ride. Something different, tight, frightened. Annie was at the door before she had finished the thought. In the yard outside the corral there was a man on horseback. He was not one of the ranch hands. He was trail-dirty and hard-eyed, and he had a piece of paper in his hand, and he was talking to Lily in a way that made the hair stand up on Annie's arms, too close, too loud, too intent. Amos was inside the corral still, but his whole body had changed. He was very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding something. "I am asking you one more time, little girl," the man on horseback said, and he was leaning down toward Lily with a manner that had threat in its posture. "Is your mother Annie Dalton?" Lily looked at him and said nothing. She was rigid with the effort of saying nothing. Annie was across the yard in 6 strides. "I am Annie Dalton," she said clearly, stepping between the man and her daughter. "Who are you and what is your business here?" The man straightened in his saddle and looked at her with an assessment that crawled over her like something cold. "Earl Dalton sent me," he said. "Your husband wants his wife and his daughter returned to Caldwell, Texas. He has papers." He held out the paper in his hand. It was a legal document, she could see that much, and her stomach turned to ice. "Earl Dalton is not my employer," said a voice behind her, very quiet and very level. Amos Stone had come over the fence of the corral without making a sound, and he was standing just behind Annie's left shoulder, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who was not performing strength but simply had it. "This does not concern you," the man on horseback said, though his eyes shifted with something that was not quite confidence. "You are on my land speaking to my employee and her child," Amos said. "It concerns me considerably. What papers does Earl Dalton have?" "A writ. His wife and his legal property are to be returned." "A woman is not property," Annie said sharply. "Not under any law in this territory or any other." The child is with her mother," Amos said, and now his voice had taken on a quality like iron, not loud, not threatening, just absolutely immovable. "I suggest you ride back to wherever you came from and tell Earl Dalton that Annie Dalton is employed at Stone Ridge in Redemption Creek, that she is an adult woman of full legal standing, that no court in the Montana Territory has authority over her employment or her movements, and that if he has a legal grievance, he is welcome to pursue it through the circuit court in Miles City, where the judge will tell him exactly the same thing I am telling you now." The man stared at him for a long moment. "You got a lawyer, ranch man." "I do not need one," Amos said. "But the woman has rights, the child is safe, and you are trespassing. I will give you to the count of 10 to turn that horse around." The man looked at Annie. He looked at Amos. He looked back at Annie, and something in his look said, "This is not over," without saying it, which was perhaps the only honest thing about him. He turned the horse and rode back down County Road 7. Annie stood very still, watching the dust of his departure. She was trembling. She could feel the trembling, and she hated it, hated that it was visible, hated that after everything it was this moment. A man on a horse with a piece of paper that cracked the composure she had been defending for months. A small hand slid into hers. Lily, pressed against her side, not saying anything, just holding on. "He will come back," Annie said quietly. "Not to anyone in particular." "Probably," Amos said, the same quietness. She turned to look at him. His face was the same steady, unreadable face it usually was, except that his eyes were doing something she had not seen before. They were looking at her with a kind of focus that was not calculation and was not pity, and was something that she recognized with a cold clarity was concern. Real, uncomplicatedly human concern. "I need to think," she said. "I might have to leave. I might have to take Lily and—" "You are not leaving," he said, and then he stopped. He looked at her carefully, and she could see him re-examining the forcefulness of those words. "I mean that you do not have to leave. If you do not want to, if you choose to stay, I will do what I can to make sure that document does not hold any legal weight here, which I do not believe it does. But it is your choice." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was lying flat and golden across the yard, and the mountains were enormous and blue behind him, and her daughter was holding her hand, and she thought about 4 months of running, and about 6 weeks of this place where the floor was wood and the kitchen smelled like sage, and her daughter had almost smiled at supper. "I want to stay," she said. Something moved across his face. Something quiet and immense, the way a wide river moves, mostly beneath the surface. "Then we will figure out the rest," he said. The next morning, Amos Stone rode into Redemption Creek and came back 3 hours later with a man named Thomas Elliott, who was a solicitor who handled land contracts and occasionally other matters for the ranching community in the county. Thomas Elliott was a thin, precise man who drank his coffee without milk and who spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with Annie explaining to her, in careful detail, what Earl Dalton's legal standing in the Montana Territory actually was, which was limited, very limited. A writ issued in Texas had no binding authority in the territory without the enforcement of the local circuit court, he explained, and the circuit court judge in Miles City was a man named Hargrove who had, on 3 separate occasions, ruled in favor of women fleeing abusive situations when the matter was presented to him clearly. "You would need to make a declaration," Thomas Elliott said, in his careful way. "A formal written statement of your circumstances. The beatings, the documented history of abuse. It is not comfortable, but it is the thing that would give Judge Hargrove the basis to issue a counterorder that would render any Texas writ unenforceable in this jurisdiction." Annie sat with her hands flat on the table. She had kept this inside for so long. The keeping of it had been, she now understood, a kind of trap, a dark cell she had built around the truth to protect herself, and in doing so had given the truth more power over her. "I can write the declaration," she said. Thomas Elliott nodded. "I can help you with the wording." From the doorway where he had been standing with his arms crossed, not inserting himself, just present, Amos Stone said, "I will ride to Miles City myself if need be, to speak to Hargrove directly." Thomas Elliott looked at him with mild surprise. "That would carry weight," he said. "A man of established standing in the county making the case in person." "Then I will go," Amos said. Annie looked at him across the room. He was already looking at her, that direct, gray-green gaze, and she said, "You do not have to do that for me." "I know," he said, and then very simply, "I want to." She wrote the declaration that evening. It took 4 hours. Thomas Elliott had given her a template and left the paper, and she sat at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed and wrote, in a hand that did not shake, the full history of her marriage to Earl Dalton. The violence, the specific dates she could remember, the names of people in Caldwell County who had witnessed things, the specific incident that had been the last. She wrote it without softening it and without dramatizing it, just laid it down in plain language like stones in a wall. And when she was done, she folded it and sealed it and put it on the kitchen shelf where the coffee tin sat. And then she put her head in her hands and breathed for a long moment. "Annie." She looked up. Amos Stone was in the kitchen doorway. She had not heard him come in. He was in his shirt sleeves, and his expression was one of the most careful things she had ever seen on a human face. Careful in the way that a man is careful when he is holding something fragile and will not risk dropping it. "I am all right," she said, before he could ask. "I know you are," he said. He came to the table and sat down across from her, the same way he sat at every meal, and he put his hands flat on the table and looked at her in that direct, unembellished way he had. "I want to ask you something, and you can tell me it is none of my business." "All right," she said. "Did you know, before you married him, what he was?" She thought about this honestly, the way he deserved. "I knew he was difficult," she said. "I knew he had a temper. I was 22 and my parents were gone, and I thought difficult could be managed." She paused. "It cannot be managed, I know that now. Some things cannot be managed, they can only be survived or left." He looked at his own hands. "My wife," he said, and stopped, and she understood that this was a rare breach in whatever he kept sealed. "Helena. She was brave in a way I never fully told her because I thought there would be more time. I thought brave was something I could tell her later." His jaw tightened very slightly. "I have thought a great deal about later since then." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the summer night was all crickets and the distant sound of cattle and the enormous breathing darkness of the territory. "I am sorry," she said, "for your loss." "I am sorry for yours," he said. "Not the loss of him, the loss of the life you should have had." Annie looked at him. She felt something move through her, not the dangerous warmth of infatuation. She was too old and too careful for infatuation, but something steadier and deeper and more terrifying for being steady. The kind of feeling that does not pass quickly, the kind that takes root. She did not say anything about it. She was not ready, and she knew it, and she thought that he knew it too. "You should sleep," he said, and stood up. "I will ride to Miles City on Thursday. Thomas Elliott will come with me." "Thank you," she said. He picked up the folded declaration from the shelf and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Lock the house tonight," he said. "Not because I think that man will come back tonight, just because." She locked the house. He rode to Miles City on Thursday with Thomas Elliot, and he came back on Saturday evening with the counterorder from Judge Hargrove, a one-page document that declared, in legal language both precise and absolute, that Annie Dalton was a free woman under Montana territorial law, that any attempt to forcibly remove her from the territory constituted criminal conduct, and that Earl Dalton's Texas writ was null and unenforceable. He put the document on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony, and she picked it up and read it twice, and then she pressed it to her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with that expression she was learning to read, the one that was full and quiet like a river running deep. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. Her voice was not steady, which surprised her. Lily was at the table and she looked at her mother's face, and then she looked at Amos Stone and she said, with the directness that children sometimes have when they cut straight to the thing no adult will say, "Does this mean we can stay? For good?" Amos Stone looked at Annie Dalton, which was the correct and respectful order of things. Annie looked at her daughter. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the kitchen around her, the sage bundle on the hook, the good cast iron stove, the window and the mountains beyond it, and the man who had built this place and maintained it with quiet, undemonstrative care for 11 years. "Yes," she said, "I believe it does." August turned toward September, and with the cooling of the air came a change in everything, subtle and profound, the way seasons turn not all at once but in 100 small ways until you look up one day and the world is different. Annie was no longer just keeping herself upright through the next hour, next day, next week. She was present. She was here. She was, with startling, disorienting regularity, happy. Not the fragile, defensive happiness of relief. Not the numb happiness of having survived something. Real happiness, the kind that had texture and taste, that showed up in small moments and stayed. The pleasure of a morning with good coffee and a clean kitchen, and the sound of Lily laughing in the barn. The satisfaction of a well-made meal appreciated without performance. The long evenings on the porch when the light turned everything amber and Amos Stone sat in the chair next to hers, and they talked, unhurriedly, about the land and the weather and books, and occasionally about things that mattered more, with the particular ease of two people who have discovered that the other person's silence is also good company. She was falling in love with him. She knew this. She did not rush toward it or run from it. She just let it grow the way good things grow in the territory, slowly, against the odds, with strong roots. He, she believed, was falling in love with her. This was harder to be certain of, because he was a man who expressed himself mostly through action rather than declaration, and his actions were so consistently attentive that it was sometimes difficult to separate what was simple decency from what was something more. But there were signs, if she was looking. He had repaired the squeaky step on the staircase that she mentioned once in passing. He had, without comment, planted a small kitchen garden along the south wall of the house because she had admired someone else's in town. He had taken to asking her opinion on ranch decisions in a way that suggested he valued what she thought, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine consultation. He saved the newspaper from town and left it on the kitchen table for her. When she was tired, which she sometimes was in the late afternoons when the work of the day caught up with her, he made her coffee without being asked. And he looked at her. He looked at her in a way that Earl Dalton had never looked at her, not with possession, not with criticism, not with the cataloging assessment of a man measuring a thing he owns. He looked at her the way you look at something you cannot quite believe you have been allowed to be near. It was on a Saturday evening in the second week of September that things shifted again. Lily had gone to bed earlier than usual, tired from a full day in the fields, and Annie and Amos were on the porch in the amber last light. The mountains were going purple with the dusk, and the cattle were distant and quiet, and Pepper the collie was asleep on the porch boards between their two chairs. Annie said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. The light on his face was the color of old gold. "Are you lonely?" she asked. "I mean, were you, before?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, not defensive about it, not embarrassed, just honest. "I was too," she said. "Even when I was not alone, that is a particular kind of lonely." He looked at her then, away from the mountains, and what was in his face was so entirely unguarded that it startled her. "Annie," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to an unasked question, and yet was entirely one. He reached across the space between their two chairs and very carefully, very deliberately, covered her hand with his. His hand was large and calloused and warm from the residual heat of the day, and he held her hand the way you hold something you are not taking, just offering to carry for a while. She turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that until the stars came out over Montana, which took a long time and was entirely worth it. In the weeks that followed, things grew between them the way the territory itself grew things, slow and determined and with deep roots. They did not rush. They had both learned in their separate ways what rushing toward the wrong thing cost. They took their time and did it properly. He courted her. There was no other word for it. He courted her in the old-fashioned sense, with respect and deliberate intention, with long evening conversations and small, consistent gestures, and a quality of attention that told her she was seen, fully seen, not as a need he was filling or a gap in his household or a solution to loneliness, but as Annie Dalton, specifically, particularly, irreplaceably. He brought her wildflowers in October, not the showy kind, just the tough little yellow things that grew in the rock seams up on the ridge, and handed them to her with such a total absence of self-consciousness that she had to look away to hide what her face was doing. She cooked him on his birthday, which she found out from Sela's, a real chocolate cake, which required a trip to town for cocoa powder she spent a good part of her wages on, and she put it on the supper table with candles made from the stub ends she found in the kitchen drawer, and when he came in and saw it, he went absolutely still for a full 5 seconds before he looked at her, and she thought perhaps that no one had made him a birthday cake since Helena. "Happy birthday, Amos," she said. He sat down at the table and he said, "Thank you, Annie," in a voice that was carefully level except for a quality in it that was not level at all, and Lily sang him the birthday song in her clear child's voice, and Annie thought, this is what a kitchen is supposed to feel like. This is what a table is supposed to feel like. This is what it is supposed to mean when people sit down together to eat. It was in November, when the first real cold of the Montana winter was settling in, and the snow had come twice and gone twice, and the mountains were putting on their permanent white, that he told her what he felt. They were in the kitchen after supper. They had been there before. The dishes were done. The house was quiet. Lily was asleep. The stove was burning and the kitchen was warm and amber-lit and small and entirely their own small world. He said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," she said. He was standing at the far end of the kitchen with his back against the counter, and he looked like a man assembling himself to say something important, which she found, despite everything, very endearing. "I am in love with you," he said, plainly, without embellishment. "I have been for some time, and I did not want to say it before you were ready to hear it. I do not need you to say anything back. I just needed you to know." Annie looked at him across the warm kitchen. "Amos," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time." He closed his eyes briefly, and the expression on his face was the kind you could look at for a very long time and never entirely describe. He crossed the kitchen, unhurried and certain, and he stood in front of her and lifted her chin with one careful finger and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. And she looked back at him, and there was no fear in her, not a trace of it, just this, just the warmth of the stove and the winter outside and this man who had given her back herself. When he kissed her, it was gentle and thorough and completely serious, the way he did most things, and she held onto the front of his shirt with both hands and kissed him back. Winter came in full force, and it was not gentle. Montana winters were not gentle. They were hard and white and demanding, and they had their own dark beauty that Annie was only beginning to understand. The cattle required constant management in the cold. The hands worked longer hours. The house needed more wood and more warmth and more of everything. And Annie found that she was equal to all of it, more than equal, because this was work she chose and loved in a place where she was safe and she was making something. Lily thrived. This was the word, the exact word. She thrived. She learned to ride Tuesday properly, not just the corral shuffle but real riding, across the field and up the ridge trail and back. And Amos taught her with the same patient, consistent instruction he gave everything. And Lily received it with a focused intensity that made Amos tell Annie privately one evening with a warmth in his voice that she loved, "That girl has a natural seat. She was born to ride." Annie watched her daughter's dark eyes go bright and staid and purposeful, and felt the deep, cellular relief of a mother watching her child become whole. The proxy letter from Caldwell County arrived in December. It was not from Earl directly. It was from his brother, Jonas Dalton, a man Annie had always found less frightening than Earl but not less dangerous, just sneakier about it. The letter informed Annie, in terse and legally clumsy language, that Earl Dalton intended to pursue his case through the territorial courts and that she had not heard the last of this matter. Annie read the letter and then handed it to Amos without comment. He read it. He set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to know that I am not asking it because of this letter. I have been thinking about asking it for a month, and this letter is not the reason." She looked at him. "All right." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring. It was not a grand ring. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that caught the light in a red, warm way, and he held it between his fingers and looked at her steadily. "Marry me," he said. "Not because it will solve the legal problem, though it will complicate things favorably for Earl Dalton if he tries to pursue them, but because I want you to be my wife, and I want to be your husband, and I want to spend my life with you and Lily and whatever else life brings us." Annie looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She looked at the house around her, solid and warm and hers, genuinely hers in every way that mattered. She thought about 22-year-old Annie Dalton who had said yes to the wrong man because she was frightened and alone and had mistaken difficulty for intensity. She thought about what that yes had cost her. She thought about what this yes would mean. "Yes," she said. "Amos, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and the garnet glowed red warm in the December light, and he kissed her temple and held her there for a moment with his arm around her and his chin resting on the top of her head, and it was quiet and warm and exactly right. They told Lily at breakfast. Lily looked at the ring on her mother's finger. She looked at Amos Stone. She looked back at her mother. "Does this mean he is my father now?" she asked in that direct way of hers. Annie opened her mouth to say something careful and thoughtful about the complexity of the situation, but Amos got there first. "If you want me to be," he said, not pressing it, not performing anything, just leaving it as an offer, open and clean. Lily looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that saw everything. Then she nodded once decisively, the way she decided everything. "All right then," she said, and picked up her spoon. Annie met Amos's eyes across the table and felt the most complete thing she had felt in years. They married in February of 1883 in the small Methodist church in Redemption Creek, in a ceremony attended by Silas and the Harver brothers and Thomas Elliott the solicitor, and a good number of the ranching families in the county who had come to know Annie over the winter months, and had taken to her the way the territory itself had, as something that belonged here. The ceremony was short and simple and entirely sincere. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected to the union, there was a brief, charged silence in which Annie became acutely aware of every person in the room. And then Lily, seated in the front pew in a new dress Annie had made her from a blue calico that turned her eyes luminous, said, clearly and with a faint proprietary edge, "Nobody objects," and several people in the congregation laughed, which broke the tension in the best possible way. Amos Stone said his vows in a voice that did not waver and looked at Annie when he said them with eyes that were entirely on her and nowhere else. And Annie said hers in a voice that wavered slightly at the end because she was human, and she had been through a great deal, and this was the good kind of overwhelmed, the kind that meant you had arrived somewhere rather than that you were being swept away. When he kissed his bride, it was again gentle and thorough, and completely serious, and the room rustled with the pleased sound of people watching two people get something they deserved. That evening, after the small supper that had been put together by half the wives of the county in the church hall, and after they had ridden home through the February cold, with Lily bundled between them in the wagon wrapped in Annie's good wool cloak, after Lily had been carried inside already mostly asleep and put to bed without waking, Amos and Annie stood together in the kitchen of Stone Ridge in the warmth of the stove, and it was quiet, and it was theirs, completely theirs. And Annie pressed her forehead against his chest and just breathed for a moment. His arms came around her. "All right," he said very quietly. "More than all right," she said. "I am just noticing it, taking it in." She felt his chest rise and fall. "Take all the time you need," he said. Spring came, and with it a letter from Thomas Elliot reporting that Earl Dalton had, in fact, initiated contact with the Miles City Circuit Court, and had been informed, in the letter from Judge Hargrove's clerk, that his claim was without merit in the territory, that his wife had legally remarried, that any further legal action would be met with the full weight of territorial law, and that he was to consider the matter closed. There had been no reply from Earl Dalton. Thomas Elliot's professional opinion, communicated in his precise way, was that Earl Dalton had calculated the cost of pursuit against his own pride and found that his pride, while significant, was not equal to the difficulty involved, which was essentially what Annie had predicted in the kitchen 11 months ago when she had said, "He hates difficulty above all things." She read the letter at the kitchen table, and when she finished she set it down and said nothing for a moment. Amos watched her. He had gotten very good at watching her, at reading the particular quality of her silences, knowing which ones needed company and which ones needed room. "It is over," she said, finally. "Yes," he said. She picked up her coffee cup and drank. "Good," she said, and that was all, and it was enough. There was a morning in April when Lily came into the kitchen while Annie was making breakfast and stood in the doorway and said, in a very particular tone, "There is a calf born this morning that does not have a mother." Annie looked at her. Amos had already gone out to the fields. "What do you mean?" "Amos found her last night. The mother did not make it. The calf is alone in the barn." Annie could see exactly where this was going. "She is very small," Lily said, which was not a request because Lily, 9 years old and already strategically masterful, never made requests when she could present facts and let the request make itself. "Does Amos know you are in here telling me this?" "He told me to tell you," Lily said, which surprised Annie. She went out to the barn. Amos was in the stall with a calf that was, as described, very small, and he was feeding her from a bottle of warmed milk with a patience that was entirely characteristic. Annie stood at the stall door and looked at the tableau. Amos Stone, the quiet cattleman, sitting in the straw in his work clothes with a motherless calf and a bottle, his big hands entirely gentle. She looked at Lily beside her, watching him with an expression that was openly adoring, the expression she had not permitted herself to show anyone for a very long time. And Amos looked up and saw the two of them in the doorway, and something moved across his face that Annie had been watching for months and knew the shape of now, that specific private warmth he reserved for them, for the specific people they were to him. "Her name is Tuesday the 2nd, Lily announced, "because Tuesday the horse is Tuesday the 1st. "A reasonable naming system," Amos agreed without irony and went back to the calf and the bottle. Annie leaned against the stall door and thought about Silas's word for him. Steady. He had said Amos was steady. She understood now that it was the most precise compliment possible. Not dramatic, not brilliant in any visible way, just unshakably, incorruptibly steady. And she had not understood until she had this how much she had been wanting steady her whole life. Summer returned, and the ranch was fully itself, humming and working and alive with the particular abundance of a well-run operation in a good year. The cattle were healthy. The kitchen garden that Amos had planted along the south wall was producing abundantly, and Annie spent happy hours in it in the early mornings before the heat came. Lily had her animals and her riding, and Amos had begun teaching her to read tracks, an old skill he had from his Ohio boyhood that translated well to the territory. And she received this education with an intensity that sometimes made the three of them laugh around the supper table. It was in June that Annie discovered she was carrying a child. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she sat with the certainty for 3 days before she told Amos, partly because she was still, in some deep old place, not entirely sure that good things would stay, and partly because she was turning the feeling over and over in her hands like a polished stone, getting used to its shape. She told him on a Sunday evening when Lily was in bed and they were on the porch and the summer dark was full of stars. She told him plainly the way he told her things without embellishment. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face in the starlight. "A child," he said. "Yes." He reached over and covered her hand with his, and she felt him breathe, a long, slow breath in, and she remembered what Silas had told her about Helena, about the child that never came, and she held his hand and waited. When he turned to look at her, his eyes were bright with something that was not sadness but was full in the way that things are full when they have been empty for a long time. "I am so glad," he said. "Annie, I am so deeply glad." She squeezed his hand. "So am I," she said. "I wanted you to know first, before Lily, before everyone." He raised their joined hands and pressed his mouth to the back of her knuckles, a gesture so careful and honest that she felt it all the way through her. The pregnancy was not entirely without difficulty. The Montana summers were hot, and the work of the ranch did not pause, and Annie was not, by nature, a person who easily accepted limitation or help. She and Amos had several candid, loving, occasionally firm conversations about what she would and would not do in the coming months, conversations in which he was consistent and gentle and entirely unmoved by her objections, not controlling, simply genuinely concerned in a way that she was learning to receive rather than deflect. Lily took the news of the coming baby with the considered seriousness she brought to most things, asked several highly specific anatomical questions that Annie answered as honestly as she could manage, and then announced that she hoped it was a brother because she had always wanted a brother and brothers seemed more interesting than sisters. This preference was communicated directly to Amos, who told Lily solemnly that he would see what he could arrange, which made Annie laugh so suddenly and completely that she had to sit down. Fall came gold and amber, and the mountains put on their best colors, and the ranch was warm with work and preparation for winter, and the very specific warm busyness of people who are making a life that they intend to keep. Silas, who had been at Stone Ridge for 14 years and had no interest in retirement, had become something that Annie could only describe as the children's honorary grandfather, a role he performed with the effortless authority of a man who had been waiting for exactly this use of himself. He taught Lily to braid rope. He taught her the names of all the stars he knew, which were many, and the names of all the birds of the territory, which were more. He told her stories about the early years of the territory that Annie was not entirely sure were all true but that were entirely wonderful, and Lily received them the way a well-loved child receives stories, trusting and entirely present. Annie watched this and thought about hidden costs and dark pasts, and how strange it was that out of the worst thing that had happened to her had come this particular table, these particular faces, this particular life. The baby was born in January of 1884, which was the coldest January in the territory in a decade, which felt both inconvenient and entirely appropriate for a Stone Ridge child. The midwife from Redemption Creek arrived through 6 inches of new snow, and Amos stayed in the kitchen because Annie told him to, but she could hear him in there. Not pacing, just present, which was exactly right. The baby was a boy. He was born howling at the cold air with an expression of profound indignation that Annie recognized immediately as the particular indignation of people who know exactly how things should be and are registering a formal complaint about the current situation. When Amos came in and she put his son in his arms for the first time, he sat down very carefully in the chair by the bed because his legs, she thought, were not entirely reliable in that moment, and he held the child and looked at him with an expression that was so completely unguarded that Annie felt she was witnessing something sacred. "Hello," Amos said to the baby, very quietly. "I am your father. You are going to be all right." Annie pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Lily came in 5 minutes later, having been carefully managed in the kitchen by Silas, and she looked at the baby in Amos's arms with the wide eyes of someone confronted with a thing they wanted enormously and which is now miraculously real. "He is red," she observed. "They start that way," Amos said. "Does he have a name?" Amos looked at Annie. Annie said, "We thought Henry Silas Stone." Lily considered this. "Henry," she said, tasting it. Then, satisfied, "He looks like a Henry." From the kitchen, Silas, who had heard his name used as the baby's middle name, was very quiet for a moment, and then made a sound that might, in another man, have been described as emotional. Henry Silas Stone opened his eyes in the blurry, unfocused way of newborns and discovered the ceiling with an expression of vague surprise. "Hello, Henry," Lily said, and leaned over to look at him directly, and Henry's vague gaze found her face with the instinctive, magnetic attention that babies sometimes turn on older children, and Lily's whole face transformed. "He is looking at me," she said, in a whisper. "He recognizes authority," Amos said. Annie laughed, which she had not expected to be able to do quite yet, and the room was full of warmth and lamplight, and the baby's small sounds and the wind outside building another winter over the mountains. The spring of 1884 was the best spring Annie had ever known, and she intended to say so on record. Henry was a baby of decided opinions and excellent lung capacity, who nonetheless slept in reasonable stretches and watched everything around him with the intent, cataloging gaze of a person taking notes. He had Amos's eyes, that sage-after-rain gray-green, which gave Annie a particular private pleasure each time she looked at him. Lily was 11 now, and had taken the transition to big sister with the same competent seriousness she brought to everything. She had negotiated with Amos a set of responsibilities regarding Henry that included specific morning and afternoon duties and had, for reasons Annie found both practical and philosophically interesting, created a written schedule which she posted on the kitchen wall. Amos had looked at the schedule the morning it appeared and said, to no one in particular, "She is going to manage something significant someday." And Annie had thought, yes, she is. It was on a morning in May, when the kitchen garden was coming in green and soft and the whole world was the color of possibility, that Amos came in from the fields at mid-morning, which he never did, and Annie looked at him from the garden with a flicker of attention. He came to the garden gate and leaned on it and watched her for a moment. "Silas is thinking of retiring," he said. "His back. He says he will give us the summer, and then his nephew in Bozeman has asked him to come." Annie felt the pang of this. "He does not want to go," she said. "No, but he should. He has earned it." He paused. "We will need someone else for the cattle work." "You will find someone," she said. "Yes." He looked at her in the garden with the light on her face and the new growth around her hands. "Are you happy, Annie?" She looked up from the plant she was tending. He was watching her with that full, quiet attention, and his question was so direct and so sincere that she felt it as a physical thing. "I am," she said, "profoundly." She paused. "Are you?" "Every day," he said. "I want you to know that, every single day of this." She stood up, brushing the soil from her hands, and walked to the gate, and he opened it for her, and she stood in front of him in the spring morning and put her hands on either side of his face, The face she knew the way she knew the mountains now, by heart and by light and by all the particular weather it moved through. "Amos," she said. "Yes. I love you. I love you," he said. "More than I knew was possible if you want the honest version." She kissed him in the garden with the spring all around them, and the baby somewhere inside making his opinions known, and Lily's voice carrying from the barn where she was talking to Tuesday the horse about something that required great emphasis. And it was all of it, exactly and specifically and irreplaceably right. That summer Silas stayed through August and spent it as he intended to spend it, watching the family he had watched be built from nothing become entirely itself. He taught Henry to wave goodbye 6 weeks before Henry was supposed to be able to do that, which Amos pointed out with fond exasperation was entirely against the natural developmental order, and Silas pointed out with great satisfaction was exactly the point. On the August evening before he left, they had a proper farewell supper, all of them at the kitchen table, and Annie made everything Silas had ever mentioned he loved, which was a significant amount of food, and they sat long at the table past the proper supper hour, talking and laughing and trading stories. And Silas held Henry on his lap for most of the evening and told him in a low, private voice things that were between the two of them. And Annie watched and let herself feel it fully, the richness of this. The particular gift of a life that had people in it who loved each other without obligation and without performance. When Silas left the next morning in the blue early light, with his few possessions in a saddlebag and his horse's breath making small clouds in the cool air, he shook Amos's hand and held it and looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Annie and she stepped forward and he held her properly, the way a father holds a daughter, and she let him. He looked at Lily last. "You are in charge," he said. "I know," Lily said, with a gravity that nearly undid them all. He rode down County Road 7, and they watched him go until the road curved and the distance took him. And then Amos put his arm around Annie's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and Lily pressed against her other side, and Henry, oblivious to the weight of the moment, blew a bubble with enormous satisfaction. Fall came, and the new hired hand, a young man named Garrett Webb who came with good references from a ranch in Billings, turned out to be competent and decent and quietly terrified of Lily's evaluative gaze, which Annie found privately hilarious and which Amos found appropriate. Lily had, over the summer, begun a correspondence with the teacher at the Redemption Creek schoolhouse, a woman named Miss Frances Aldrich, who had recognized in Lily a quality of mind that warranted specific attention, and who offered, on 2 mornings a week, additional lessons to students who wanted them. Lily wanted them with an intensity that satisfied something deep in Annie's chest, watching her daughter pursue knowledge the way she had always known Lily would, given safety and time, and the room to grow into who she actually was. There were discussions at the kitchen table in the evenings, sometimes, about what Lily might become. She said variously, a veterinarian, which was difficult for women in 1884, but not, she pointed out with characteristic precision, impossible. A lawyer, which was even more difficult, but which she noted with the same precision had precedence. A rancher, at which Amos said simply, "That can be arranged." And once memorably, president, at which Amos said she was 37 years too young for consideration, and Lily said she was aware of this and was planning ahead. Annie listened to these conversations and loved them with everything in her. The second pregnancy Annie discovered in October of 1884, when Henry was 9 months old and the ranch was golden with late fall. She told Amos the same way she had told him the first time, on the porch in the evening, plainly, and he responded in the same way, with a long, quiet breath and his hand over hers in the same expression of deep and entirely unperformative gladness. "You are not tired?" he asked. "I am always tired," she said. "I am also always all right. These are not exclusive conditions." "I will help more," he said. "You already help more than any man I have known," she said. "That is not a difficult bar," he said, with the dry, quiet humor he sometimes employed, and she laughed. The second child was born in June of 1885, at the beginning of the summer, in the same bedroom with the same midwife and Amos in the kitchen again, present and steady as the mountains. This baby was a girl. They named her Frances, after the teacher who had recognized what Lily was made of, and Frances Stone arrived with Amos's eyes and Annie's hair and a serene, watchful quality that suggested she was already taking stock of the situation and finding it acceptable. Lily held her sister with an expression of open, wondering love that made Annie understand entirely what her own mother must have felt watching her hold things fragile and new. "She looks like both of you," Lily said, studying Frances with the thoroughness of a person conducting a proper assessment. "She has your mouth, Mama, and Amos's forehead." "That is a very specific analysis," Amos said. "I am a specific person," Lily said without looking up. Amos met Annie's eyes over Lily's head, and what passed between them in that look was everything. The long history of how they had gotten here, the dark past that had led, against all reasonable expectation, to this lit kitchen and these particular people, and the immense, sustaining, unshakable reality of what they were to each other. The summer of 1885 was long and good. Henry learned to walk with great determination and no grace, launching himself across the kitchen floor toward whatever interested him with a total confidence in his own momentum that everyone found both admirable and mildly concerning. Frances regarded her world from Annie's arms or Lily's arms with the composed attention of a person who is in no hurry, because they have already decided that everything is generally satisfactory. Garrett Webb, who had proven to be not merely competent but genuinely skilled, had brought in 2 additional hands for the summer, and Stone Ridge was operating at a scale that made Amos think about expansion. A thought he brought to Annie because he brought everything to Annie now, because they were each other's first consultation on every matter. They talked about it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with the lamp between them and the coffee cups, and the particular ease of 2 people who have been honest with each other long enough that honesty has become not an effort but a texture, the natural surface of how they communicate. He spread out a map and showed her the adjacent land parcel that Old Man Holloway had been trying to sell for 2 years, and she looked at it and asked the questions she always asked, the practical ones and the forward-looking ones, and he answered them with the same directness, and they made the decision together as they made all decisions, and when they were finished Amos folded the map and looked at her across the table. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That man you were when you walked up County Road 7, he said, and she understood he meant person, not man, that the language was just the habit of the time. "You and Lily. Walking 7 miles in the heat with a canvas bag, and you knocked on my fence post and told me you cooked better than anyone in the county who had not tried you yet." He smiled, the full real smile she still considered a particular privilege each time it appeared. "I believed you immediately." "You would have been right even if you had not," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I knew it then too, actually. I just needed the evidence." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, reversing the gesture of that first evening, and he turned his palm up and held on. "I thought I was coming to cook and clean for a quiet cattleman in Montana," she said. "I thought it was survival, just the next thing and then the next thing after that. And instead," he said, "and instead," she said, "it was everything, all of it at once." She looked at him. "You told Lily once that her mother had carried more than any person should. Do you remember that?" He looked at her for a moment. It had been early on, a morning when Lily had come to him in the barn, troubled by something she could not quite name, and he had sat with her in the straw and she had asked him, with the directness she always used, if her mother was going to be okay, and he had looked at that 9-year-old girl with her watchful eyes and her old too-soon face, and he had said, "Your mama has carried more than any person should, and that changes now." He had said it simply as a fact, as a promise about what this place was going to be. "I remember," he said. "She told me," Annie said. "She told me that night." She came and got in my bed the way she used to when she was smaller, and she said, "Amos told me your carrying is done now." She said it like it was the most settled thing in the world. Amos was quiet for a moment. Was she right? Annie looked at the kitchen around her. The lamp, the shelves with the coffee and the flour and the preserves, the sage bundle on the hook that she replaced each fall, the map on the table and his hands, and the sound of the children breathing in their rooms upstairs. "Yes," she said. She was entirely right. He leaned across the table and kissed her, careful and thorough and completely serious, the way he did everything. Outside, the Montana summer dark was enormous and full of stars. The kind of stars you can only see where the sky is wide enough to hold them all. And the cattle were settled in the fields, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and Tuesday the calf, long since grown into a fine young heifer with Lily's particular fondness attached to her, moved somewhere in the dark with the slow, comfortable rhythm of a creature that has found its right place and knows it. Inside, the lamp burned and the coffee cooled, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table they had shared for 3 years, in the house that had been his and had become theirs, in the life that had been built from nothing and from the worst of things into the best. And they talked until late, the way they did most nights, about ordinary things and extraordinary things and the steady, particular, irreplaceable miracle of a life shared with the right person. In the room upstairs, Lily slept with her books and her schedule and her plans for the future. A girl who had learned too young what betrayal felt like and had learned, slower and sweeter, what safety felt like, what it meant to have a man look at her mother like she was worth looking at, what it meant to have a father who consulted your opinion and told you the truth and taught you the names of the stars. In the small wooden crib beside the window, Frances Stone slept with her composed, contented face turned toward the summer dark. And Henry Silas Stone slept the sleep of the deeply certain, a boy who had never known anything other than this warmth, this steadiness, this kitchen, these people, and who would grow up understanding without ever having been told that this was what a home was, not a structure, not a location, but a place made safe by the quality of attention the people in it paid to each other. The year turned toward 1886, and the territory was changing, as the territory always was. New homesteads going up along the creek roads, the railroad talk that had been talk for years becoming something more concrete, Redemption Creek growing in the way that western towns grew when the land around them proved workable, and the people in them proved staying. There were new families, new names at the church, new children in the schoolhouse where Miss Aldrich had expanded her instruction to include an afternoon class that Lily attended with a focused satisfaction that Annie recognized as a person doing the thing they were meant for. Stone Ridge added the Holloway parcel that winter, and by spring, there were twice as many cattle, and Amos had built a second bunkhouse for the hands he now employed. And Annie had a full, proper kitchen garden that had expanded along the entire south wall and wrapped around the corner toward the east, and she was growing things that she had never grown before. Herbs from the seed catalog and varieties of squash, and a small but determined bed of sunflowers that Lily had requested, and which came up in July like a wall of gold against the barn. On a July morning in 1886, Annie stood in the sunflower bed with Henry on her hip and Frances toddling at her feet on the new grass, watching Lily cross the yard from the barn with Tuesday's halter in her hand and Amos coming in from the far field through the gate with the easy, unhurried walk she would know from any distance. And she thought, this is the life that was supposed to happen. Not despite everything, but through it and past it and on the other side of it. She thought about the morning she had stood outside the general store in Redemption Creek with 11 cents in her dress pocket and a hand-lettered notice in her hand. She thought about walking 7 miles in the July heat with a canvas bag. She thought about her daughter's face when she found out there was a wood floor. She thought about a man with sage-green eyes who had turned from his fence and looked at her and her daughter and said, simply and without drama, that there were 2 rooms available. She thought about the long arc of it, the terrifying and the beautiful and the slow, patient, entirely real work of becoming safe enough to love and be loved back. And she thought about how none of it had been guaranteed, and all of it had been worth it, and how the two things were related in some essential way she could not entirely articulate but could feel entirely clearly. Amos reached her at the edge of the sunflower bed. He stopped and looked at her and at Henry on her hip and Francis at her feet. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Everything," she said. "All of it." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with one careful finger. "Good everything or bad everything?" "All good," she said. "Every last piece of it." He looked at her in that full, particular way of his, the way that had not changed in 4 years, the way she thought would never change because it was not a performance. It was just what she was to him, visible and specific and entirely known. "Good," he said. Lily's voice came across the yard. "Are we having dinner today or are we doing this again?" Amos looked over his shoulder at her. "This," he said. "Standing in the garden staring at each other," Lily said, with the fond exasperation of a 12-year-old managing 2 adults who still, after 4 years, had not entirely learned to be efficient about their feelings. "We are coming," Annie said, and did not move immediately, because Henry had grabbed a fistful of Amos's shirt with his small, determined hand, and was pulling his father toward him with great insistence. And Amos picked him up with an ease that came from a year of practice, and Henry immediately pressed his forehead against his father's jaw in the manner he favored. And Frances raised her arms to be carried, and Annie picked her up. And the 4 of them walked across the yard toward the kitchen where Lily had already, characteristically, started the stove. The mountains watched them come. The Montana sky held them, vast and blue and full of the light that was particular to this place, this land, this summer. And the house, the solid, good, stone-chimneyed house at the end of County Road 7, stood waiting to receive them the way it always did, warm and lit and exactly theirs, exactly right.